On the cold evening of December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat alone in his Kremlin office and signed his own country out of existence. With a single stroke of a pen, the Soviet Union vanished from the map of the world. No invasion, no surrender ceremony, no American tanks rolling through Red Square, just silence. Outside, soldiers lowered the red hammer and sickle flag from the Kremlin for the last time, and a superpower that had terrified the planet for nearly 70 years simply ceased to be. It had possessed the largest standing army on Earth, enough nuclear weapons to end civilization several times over, and an ideology that promised to bury capitalism forever. Yet not a single American soldier had fired a shot to bring it down. That is the first shock most people never fully process. The Soviet Union did not lose a war in the traditional sense. It collapsed, slowly, quietly, methodically. And the weapon that killed it was not an army, but time. This was the longest war ever fought, and almost no one who lived through it understood how it was actually being won. Because while the world watched proxy wars, missile parades, and fiery speeches, another conflict was unfolding beneath the surface. A war waged with patience instead of panic, with dollars instead of bullets, with ideas instead of invasions. It was a war designed not to defeat the Soviet Union on the battlefield, but to force it to defeat itself. That strategy did not come from generals or admirals. It came from a diplomat. In February of 1946, an American Foreign Service officer named George Kennan sat in Moscow and wrote an 8,000-word telegram back to Washington. Kennan had spent years inside the Soviet system, observing its leadership, its paranoia, and its internal contradictions. What he sent was not intelligence in the traditional sense. It was a diagnosis. He argued that the Soviet Union was not strong. It was brittle. It appeared monolithic, but it was held together by fear, repression, and the constant need for an external enemy. Kennan's conclusion was radical for its time. The United States did not need to invade the Soviet Union. It did not need to bomb it. It simply needed to contain it, to deny it expansion, to force it to compete in a world where its own system would betray it. If America could wait long enough, the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. That idea required something profoundly un-American. Patience measured not in election cycles, but in generations. The first test of that patience came almost immediately in the ruined heart of Europe, Berlin, a city shattered by war and divided by ideology. In June of 1948, Joseph Stalin made his move. He ordered a total blockade of all road and rail access to West Berlin, trapping over 2 million civilians behind Soviet lines. His calculation was cold and precise. The Americans would either abandon the city and look weak, or fight their way through and risk a third world war. What Stalin did not anticipate was that the United States would refuse both options. Instead, American and British aircraft began landing in Berlin every 90 seconds, day and night, in snow, fog, and darkness. They brought food, coal, medicine, everything a city needed to survive. For 11 months, Soviet soldiers stood helplessly at the edge of the runways, watching planes roar overhead, knowing they could not stop them without firing the first shot of a war they could not win. In May of 1949, Stalin quietly lifted the blockade. He had lost, not to force, but to resolve. That moment mattered far more than most people realize. It proved a critical point. When confronted without panic, the Soviet Union would blink. That same year, 12 nations signed a treaty forming NATO, a military alliance that encircled the Soviet sphere of influence. It was not an offensive weapon. It was a cage, exactly as Kennan had envisioned. Expansion was denied. The borders hardened. And inside those borders, the Soviet system was forced to sustain itself without conquest. Throughout the 1950s, the Cold War expanded into the shadows. The CYA and its counterparts engaged in covert operations across the globe, intervening wherever governments drifted toward Moscow's orbit. Iran, Guatemala, Southeast Asia. These were not moral victories. They were strategic ones. Each intervention denied the Soviet Union another satellite, another resource, another victory it needed to justify its own existence. Meanwhile, when uprisings occurred inside the Soviet Empire, Hungary in 1956, crushed under tank treads, the Kremlin revealed the truth it could not hide, that communism could only survive through violence against its own people. The images traveled far beyond Eastern Europe. America did not need to speak. The Soviet Union was condemning itself. Then, in October of 1957, the war shifted to a new battlefield: space. When Sputnik beeped its way across the night sky, panic rippled through the United States. The Soviet Union had beaten America into orbit. To many, it looked like proof that communism was winning the future. But beneath the fear was a misunderstanding that would prove fatal for Moscow. The Soviet system could achieve spectacular, singular feats by concentrating all resources into one objective. But it could not sustain innovation across an entire society. America responded not with imitation, but escalation. NASA was formed. The moon became the target. And unlike the Soviet command economy, the American system thrived on decentralized innovation. Universities, private companies, engineers, and entrepreneurs all pushed forward at once. Every ruble the Soviet Union spent launching cosmonauts was a ruble not spent feeding its people or modernizing its factories. The space race was not a contest of rockets. It was a stress test of economic systems. In 1961, the Soviets made their most honest confession to the world. They built a wall through Berlin, not to keep enemies out, but to keep their own citizens in. Concrete, barbed wire, and guard towers replaced ideology. It was an admission of failure carved into the heart of Europe. 1 year later, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before. In October of 1962, Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba. For 13 days, American and Soviet forces stood on the brink. In the end, it was Nikita Khrushchev who backed down, ordering his ships to turn around. Inside the Kremlin, officials called it a humiliation. More importantly, it confirmed a pattern. When pushed to the edge, Moscow would retreat. That knowledge would shape everything that followed. Because from this point forward, the war was no longer about survival. It was about pressure, relentless, calculated pressure applied across economics, technology, ideology, and time. And as the 1970s approached, the Soviet Union was about to be pushed into a competition it could not escape and could never win. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Union was no longer fighting to dominate the world. It was fighting to keep up with it. That shift marked the beginning of the end, because history rarely forgives powers forced into permanent reaction instead of leadership. President Richard Nixon understood what decades of Soviet propaganda tried to conceal. The communist world was fractured. Beneath the rhetoric of unity lay rivalry, resentment, and fear. The deepest fault line ran between Moscow and Beijing, two communist giants bound by ideology but divided by ambition. And in February of 1972, Nixon exploited that fracture without firing a shot. When Air Force One landed in Beijing and Nixon shook hands with Mao Zedong, the strategic map of the Cold War changed overnight. For the Kremlin, it was a nightmare. The Soviet Union suddenly faced a hostile China along a 4,000-mile border while still confronting NATO and Europe. No army could solve that problem. Only money could. And Moscow did not have enough. From that moment on, Soviet military spending spiraled upward. Tanks, missiles, submarines, aircraft, everything multiplied. But unlike the United States, the Soviet Union lacked an economy capable of sustaining such pressure. American defense spending was backed by a civilian economy that generated innovation, productivity, and wealth. The Soviet system produced weapons, not prosperity, steel without profit, rockets without consumer goods. Estimates suggest the Kremlin devoted as much as a quarter of its entire economy to military spending. Even a capitalist system would struggle under that burden. A command economy was doomed by it. The contrast between systems became stark. In the United States, competition punished failure and rewarded efficiency. Innovation spread outward from defense projects into civilian life: computers, communications, manufacturing. In the Soviet Union, innovation flowed upward into bureaucracy. Factories met quotas, not demand. Goods existed on paper while shelves remained empty. By the mid-1970s, the consequences reached Soviet kitchens. The workers' paradise could not feed its workers. Inefficiency and mismanagement forced the unthinkable. The Soviet Union began importing millions of tons of grain from the United States. Capitalism was feeding communism. It was an ideological humiliation Moscow could never publicly admit. Eastern Europe, once portrayed as liberated allies, became economic liabilities. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, all required subsidies and control. Instead of strengthening the Soviet Union, the empire drained it. Expansion, once essential to communist legitimacy, had turned parasitic. And then there was technology. While American engineers pushed forward with microchips and personal computers, Soviet planners struggled to replicate designs they barely understood. Espionage could steal blueprints, but it could not reproduce the culture of innovation behind them. Each year, the technological gap widened. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States tightened the screws. Export controls expanded. Access to Western technology narrowed. The Soviet Union was forced to compete in a race while being denied the tools to run it. Containment had become suffocation. Then came Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet troops crossed the border, expecting a quick intervention. Instead, they entered a decade-long war of attrition. American-supplied weapons turned Soviet helicopters into burning wreckage. Body bags returned home. Veterans spoke. The myth of invincibility collapsed, one funeral at a time. As the war dragged on, the United States escalated pressure yet again. President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. Whether it was feasible mattered less than the signal it sent. America was prepared to spend whatever it took. The Soviet Union was not. Matching American spending risked economic collapse. Falling behind rendered decades of military investment obsolete. Either option was fatal. If this analysis is resonating with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep this kind of serious, long-form history alive for those who lived it, and those who need to understand it. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was exhausted. Economic growth had stalled. Public faith had eroded. Leadership was aging and disconnected. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power, he inherited a system already failing. His reforms were not revolutionary acts. They were survival attempts. Glasnost and perestroika loosened controls the system depended on. Once people were allowed to speak openly, decades of suppressed truth erupted. Corruption, nationalism, anger. The state could no longer contain what it had revealed. The Soviet Union was not defeated by invasion. It was defeated by exposure. Forced to compete, forced to compare, forced to confront realities it could no longer hide. And as the 1980s drew to a close, the final act was already unavoidable. Because when an empire loses faith in its future, collapse is no longer a possibility. It is a countdown. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer losing ground gradually or invisibly. The unraveling had become unmistakable. Not through invasion, not through revolution in the streets, but through exhaustion. An exhaustion that settles into a system when it has been pushed beyond its limits for far too long. Decades of sustained American pressure had achieved what no foreign army ever managed. It forced the Soviet state to compete in arenas where its very architecture worked against survival, economics, technology, productivity, morale, and ultimately legitimacy. There was no single fatal decision, no dramatic battlefield defeat. What destroyed the Soviet Union was accumulation. Year after year of military spending that created fear abroad, but scarcity at home. Entire industries devoted to tanks, missiles, and submarines while civilian infrastructure decayed quietly in the background. Military parades rolled through Red Square with perfect precision, yet ordinary citizens stood in lines for bread, meat, and basic necessities. The Soviet economy had been engineered for permanent mobilization, and it discovered too late that a nation cannot live forever as if tomorrow's war matters more than today's life. The United States, by contrast, waged the Cold War without freezing its society in place. While investing heavily in defense, American life continued to expand. Cities grew outward, highways stretched across the continent, suburbs filled. Technology accelerated at a pace no central planner could ever control. Innovation escaped military laboratories and transformed civilian life. Televisions became common. Cars became more reliable. Homes filled with appliances designed to save time, not glorify sacrifice. Later, computers moved from research facilities into offices and eventually into living rooms. This difference mattered far more than speeches, propaganda, or diplomatic statements, because it created a comparison that could not be fully censored. Through television signals bleeding across borders, foreign radio broadcasts, smuggled magazines, black market videotapes, and personal stories, Soviet citizens could see how Americans lived. Not as caricatures, not as monsters, but as ordinary people with choices. Choice became the most dangerous weapon of all. A system that claimed moral, economic, and historical superiority could no longer explain why its citizens waited in lines while its rival enjoyed abundance, variety, and mobility. The collapse began psychologically long before it became political. Capitalism did not march into the Soviet Union. It did not need to. It simply performed better. And by doing so, it exposed the central lie that sustained the system. That endless sacrifice today would guarantee prosperity tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Each year demanded more patience, more obedience, more endurance, while delivering less in return. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, the crisis was already irreversible. His reforms were not acts of ideological betrayal. They were acts of necessity. Glasnost was intended to restore trust by allowing limited truth. Perestroika aimed to restore efficiency by loosening rigid controls. But the Soviet system had survived for decades by suppressing information and limiting comparison. Once those restraints were lifted, reality flooded in faster than reform could manage. Corruption, long whispered about in kitchens and corridors, became visible and undeniable. Economic failure could no longer be blamed entirely on hostile enemies. The data spoke too clearly. National identities buried beneath decades of enforced ideology resurfaced across the republics. And fear, the invisible force that had held the entire structure together, began to dissolve. The military, once the ultimate symbol of Soviet power, turned into the system's greatest contradiction. Maintaining massive global forces while hospitals deteriorated, housing crumbled, and infrastructure aged beyond repair forced an unavoidable question. What was all this power actually protecting? Strength that cannot sustain the society behind it is not strength. It is obligation without purpose. In Eastern Europe, the illusion cracked first. Governments that had once ruled through fear began negotiating instead of repressing. Reform replaced force. And when Soviet tanks did not roll in to stop them, the truth became unmistakable. The empire existed not because it was constantly enforced, but because everyone believed it would be. Once that belief disappeared, control evaporated almost instantly. Inside the Soviet Union itself, loyalty eroded quietly. Soldiers hesitated. Officials delayed. Institutions stopped acting with confidence. Orders were questioned. Authority felt uncertain. In August of 1991, hardliners attempted to reverse history through a coup, believing force could restore what legitimacy no longer supported. It collapsed within days. The state that once ruled over a quarter of the planet could no longer command obedience, even from its own security forces. By December, the end arrived not with chaos, but with formality. Documents were signed, authority was transferred, a flag was lowered against a winter sky. Silence replaced certainty. A superpower disappeared not because it was defeated in battle, but because it could no longer justify its own existence. The United States had not destroyed the Soviet Union with bombs, invasions, or conquest. It had outlasted it by applying pressure instead of panic, by sustaining competition instead of seeking domination, by trusting that a system built on coercion could not endure indefinitely in a world increasingly shaped by choice, information, and comparison. This is the deeper lesson of the Cold War, and one that still matters. Empires do not always fall to enemies at the gate. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of what they are forced to pretend is normal, year after year, generation after generation. If you lived through this era, if you served during it, watched it unfold, or carried its weight, your perspective matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value serious, respectful history, told without exaggeration, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Not for nostalgia, but for understanding. because the quiet wars fought without declarations or invasions often shape the world more permanently than the loud ones ever could.